Okay, welcome to the Academy of Sinology at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. My name is Kelly No, and I'd like to ask you a few questions. Now, you don't have to reply, you just have a think about them. Do you believe in luck? Have you ever wondered whether it's actually possible for a person to change their life destiny? And why is it that some people seem to encounter more misfortune than others? Can we do anything to prevent personal misfortune and disasters? In this series of lectures, Dr. Catherine No and I are very grateful for the opportunity in the Academy to explore with you a popular Taoist text. And it's the text that holds the answers to all of these questions and more. The text is called, in English, the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. And in Chinese, it's called 太上感应篇. Now, the treatise explains how we go about cultivating good ethical character and improving our fortunes in life. It explains how we go about cultivating the, you could say, the good deeds that are bound to be rewarded by good fortune, and how to avoid the misdeeds that incur misfortune. So you can probably start to understand it's a very pragmatic, very practical text. It's based on the principle of cause and effect. As they say, a person reaps what they sow. Now, we'll find that the contents of this particular book resonates with many of the world's ethical and religious traditions. The language of the text is very clear and concise. It's only a very short book. And there are stories in the commentaries on the text. They're basically historical accounts that illustrate the principles in the text and how lives have been changed through the treatise. Now, since the treatise was published in the 12th century, it's actually come to become the most popular Taoist text in China. It's been well known and well loved among both young and old, and it's appealed to people from all walks of life. In fact, the treatise was so widely circulated that any rural village in China that even possessed a few books was bound to have a copy of the treatise. I'm going to share with you just 3 stories from the beginning, near the beginning of the commentaries on the treatise. Well, not long after the treatise was published, the year is 1161, there was a regional official by the name of Wang Xiang, and he read the treatise. He was very inspired, and he committed himself to practicing over 20 of the good deeds outlined in the text. So he committed himself to putting them into practice. He chose 20, or over 20, the ones that he thought he could manage, and he committed himself to doing so. Well, one day, Wang Xiang became very ill, to the point of actually passing away. And as you can imagine, his family, his friends, they were distraught. They gathered around him and they cried. They were crying in their grief. Well, the funny thing was, Wang Xiang, he had passed away, but he could sort of still hear the sounds of their crying very softly, as if from a distance. And it seemed to him like the sound of a wasp. The other strange thing was he heard a voice of a spirit who said, Wang Xiang has recently decided to put into practice the teachings of the treatise. This is the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. We must quickly let him return. And sure enough, Wang Xiang actually, came back to life. It was like a miracle. And we can see from his experience that, well, he actually went on to live to the age of 102. So from this particular story of his experience, just by being serious about cultivating good deeds. And Wang Xiang had, just started learning about the treatise and, really just started going about putting these good deeds into practice. But he was rewarded. He got his life back, essentially a second chance at life. And probably, applied himself to the good deeds because he went on to live to the age of 102. That's Wang Xiang's story. There's another story. This is about Wang Yuan of Zhejiang province. Now, Wang Yuan, he was poor and he didn't have any children. He would read the treatise and study it daily while he was looking after his elderly mother. Now, he wanted to do some good deeds in the hopes that it would bring benefit to his elderly mother. He hoped that his mum would live a very long, healthy life. And he also wished for a son to continue the family line. It was very important in the past, not only for a family to have sons, or at least one son, to continue the family line for matters of family property and inheritance, but also to ensure that there would be offerings for ancestral remembrance that was important for the whole family's ancestors. Well, he hoped that his mother could live a long, healthy life, and he also wished for a son. And what did Wang Xiang do? Well, he donated some money. He didn't have very much, but he donated what he could for the treatise to be reprinted so that more people could have the opportunity to learn and benefit from the text. Well, amazingly, just after the very first chapter had been reprinted, his wife became pregnant and she gave birth to their son, their first child. And his elderly mother, sure enough, she lived very long age, lived to a very old age. And so, Wang Xiang would often say to his friends and people around him, the law of cause and effect is much manifest. I simply had the sincere thought to do a good deed, and I hoped that my mother could live a long, healthy life, and she achieved longevity. I wished for a son, and a son was born. So, how did Wang Xiang get his wishes to be answered so accurately? Well, we'll find out very shortly as we start to read the text ourselves. And finally, there's a Chen Bisong, who was a very kind man. He was a bit of a philanthropist. He would always help out the needy and support all the charitable causes for the benefit of the wider community. Well, one time, Mr. Chen, he was away from home, traveling probably on matters of business, but months of heavy rain delayed his homecoming, delayed him from coming home. So as you can imagine, his family, his wife and children were really hoping that he would come home soon. And his wife would wait up every night, hoping that her husband would come back. Well, one of these nights, she heard a loud noise at the gates, and she thought, well, she was frightened. The reason was because at this time in the local neighborhood, in that community, there'd been a spate of robberies. So she thought, oh my gosh, thieves have arrived at our house. So she called out immediately to alert all the members of the household to flee, to escape. And just as the last person left the building, a high wall collapsed, and the entire house, including everything inside the house, was basically reduced to rubble. There was nothing left. But fortunately, everyone of Chen Bisong's family was saved. They escaped unscathed. So it sounds like Chen Bisong's the many good deeds that he did. I forgot to say that he actually, among the various good deeds, he donated money to reprint the treatise so that it could be circulated far and wide. That's very important. So you could say that, the sum total of all of his good deeds certainly brought benefit to his family as well. And the treatise helps us to understand how that works. So the treatise is, you could think of it as a foundational text. It's actually one of the earliest texts in the genre of morality books. And these were sort of part of the mainstream popular culture for centuries in China. Now, while the treatise, even though the treatise is considered to be a Taoist text, it's associated with the Taoist tradition of thought, it was read by virtually everyone, read and well known throughout society. And even the Buddhist masters would teach the treatise and promote the text. Now, a case in point is Great Master Yingguang of the Pure Land tradition of Buddhism. In the early 20th century, Great Master Yingguang, he sponsored the reprint of over 3 million copies of the treatise, over 3 million copies, so that, it could be available to more people and they could learn and benefit from the text. Now, this is a Taoist text, and he sponsored the reprint of over 3 million copies. That number far exceeded the copies that he made of other texts, including Buddhist texts. So that's very significant. Another example would be the late Venerable Master Jin Kung. And Venerable Master has lectured on the treatise numerous times. In the last set of recorded lectures, Venerable Master actually spent almost 100 hours talking about this very short text. And in the 1990s, while Venerable Master was in Singapore, he was already in his 70s, he was busy giving lectures on more than one Buddhist sutra at the one time, several sutras actually, but he still found the time every morning after breakfast to teach the treatise to his students, every day. So it really goes to show the importance of the learning that we find in the treatise for everyone's learning to cultivate good ethical character and to improve their life fortunes. Now, Venerable Master actually had an alternative title to this text, and he would call it How to Accrue Good Fortune and Avoid Disasters. So that's some food for thought. Now, we have a general understanding of what the text is basically about. I'm going to talk about what the title means and have a look at the opening passage of the text. Now, the opening passage is very important. It contains, you could say, the core message, the global message of the entire book. So we'll look at the title first. The title, as I've said, is The Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. What does exalted mean? Exalted means it's a title of respect, an honorary title that is taken to refer to Lao Tzu, who is revered as the founder of the Taoist tradition of thought. Now, Lao Tzu is thought to have lived over 2,500 years ago. He was a senior contemporary of Confucius, and the treatise is considered to form part of his teachings, and so the text is attributed to him. So the Exalted One is taken as a reference to Lao Tzu. Just notice that Sherry has her hand up.
Hi, sorry, Teacher Kelly. I was just wondering, is there a slide to that you're sharing currently?
No, there won't be any slides, but if you listen carefully, because the text is that we're covering today is very short, so there won't be slides today.
Okay,
Thank
that's
you very
fine.
much for your question. Okay. So we're talking about the title, Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. What exalted means. Now, one interpretation is that it refers to Lao Tzu, the founder of the Taoist tradition of thought. There's another interpretation. And on another level, it's taken to refer to this exalted is a description of the innate goodness of our human nature, something that's, everyone is born with, these incipient moral qualities. And why it's considered to be the exalted treatise is because by learning and according with the teachings in this text, the person is able to realize and really bring out their innate moral goodness. They could say that achieve moral excellence. And so this treatise is respected as the exalted treatise. So two interpretations, and both of them are equally valid. Exalted treatise just means a piece of writing, like an essay or an article. What is this writing about? It's the exalted treatise on the response of the Tao. Now, the Tao, in a nutshell, it refers to the natural way of the universe, the way things are, the reason why the seasons change, for example, when and how they do. So you can think of it, basic terms, the natural way of the universe. Now, this treatise is on the response of the Tao. So it's about the natural law of cause and effect, how the natural way of the universe responds to causes. What causes? Well, however, thought, word, and action is a cause that will have an effect on the future. It's in basic terms. And this principle or natural law of cause and effect, it's a natural universal phenomenon. It's a bit like the law of gravity. We might not be able to see it, but it still applies whether you believe or not. So that's the principle of cause and effect. And for some people, I find it handy to think about, use a plant analogy. So you have, you grow plants from their seeds. The seed of the plant might be taken as the cause, and whatever grows from that seed, the plant, its fruits and flowers, all of that, you could consider as the effect. So you have the seed and the plant, cause and effect. And that's a bit like how when we cultivate good deeds, we're bound to enjoy the good fortune, the effects being the good fortune. So that's the connection between cause and effect. And by the same token, when we commit misdeeds, they will lead us to suffer the effects of misfortune. So in basic terms, the law of cause and effect, a natural, universal phenomenon. It's been in place ever since there was life. So, and this effect, I suppose, refers not just to one person's future, but you could say it refers to, it encompasses the future of their family and also society, because, what one person thinks and does inevitably affects everyone around them. Okay, we'll come back to this idea a little bit later. But in a nutshell, you could take the exalted treatise on the response of the Tao to mean Lao Tzu's teachings on the natural law of cause and effect. That's in a nutshell. Okay, that's the title of the text and what it means. We'll turn now to the opening passage. And as I mentioned before, it's pretty much the core global message of the entire book. If you remember nothing else, this is the most important part. Okay, I'll read it out. It's very short. So the Exalted One states, there are no gates to fortune and misfortune. They're simply brought about by one's conduct. The outcomes of reward and retribution are as shadow follows form. Now, don't worry if you don't remember. We'll come back to the various parts of this opening passage. The first part, the exalted one, refers to Lao Tzu, as just mentioned. And there are no gates to fortune and misfortune. Fortune and misfortune, the treatise makes it very clear from the outset that they're not sort of destinations that a person just happens to come across. And they certainly don't sort of just arrive on our doorsteps. Why are there no gates to fortune and misfortune? Well, the reason is because a person's fortunes, whether it's good fortune or misfortune, is largely determined by the nature of their thoughts. That's the root cause. A person's fortune simply corresponds to the nature of their thoughts, and whether it's good fortune or misfortune, it is all brought about by their deeds in thought, words, or actions. So it means it makes it very clear that a person has to take responsibility for the things that happen to them, for actually everything that happens to them. There are no gates to fortune or misfortune. They're simply brought about by oneself, one's conduct. Okay. Now, to give an example, two people could be doing exactly the same thing, but their intentions, their thoughts, determine whether what they're doing is actually cultivating a good deed or they're actually committing a misdeed. And I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say two people are cooking a meal at home. The first person, they're thinking about how to cook a meal that's nutritious and delicious for their family to be healthy and happy. Right, so that's the first person. The other person is also cooking a meal. It could be exactly the same thing, but what they're thinking is, well, it's my turn to cook tonight, and I'll just cook whatever I feel like having. They don't even bother to consider the needs or the preferences of the rest of the household or the other members of the household. So I think it's pretty obvious who is sort of cultivating a good deed and who might be committing a misdeed in their selfishness. So the idea is that, we often hear that it's the thought that counts. Well, in terms of this natural law of cause and effect, thoughts definitely count, but they also make all the difference in terms of the consequences that we end up with, as we'll see further on in the text. So there are no gates to fortune and misfortune. They're simply brought about by one's conduct. Well, there was a Wei Zhongda who was a young government official, and he lived in around the 12th century. He served in the Imperial Academy, and that was sort of the highest academic institution of the state. So he was a fairly accomplished young government official. Well, one day he had a very unique opportunity, and he was able to visit the netherworld. And this is a place where people go after they've passed away to be judged. So he hadn't passed away, but he had this unique opportunity to go, and he could see the officials down there, these spirit officials, sort of checking through his records, verifying his good deeds and the records of his misdeeds. And he was absolutely horrified to see that there were masses and masses of the records of his misdeeds. They took up virtually the entire hall where these officials were working. And so he's really shocked. And the spirits, these officials actually took these records and weighed them. So on the one scale, there was actually just the records of his good deeds, believe it or not, only took up one thin scroll, just a single scroll. So that was on the one side of the scale. And on the other were the masses and masses, piles of records of his misdeeds. And the amazing thing was this one thin scroll of his good deeds actually outweighed, it was heavier than the piles of the misdeeds, the records of his misdeeds. And so Weijongda, he's super curious. And he asks one of the spirit officials, says, look, I'm not even 40 years old yet. How can there be so many, records of my misdeeds? Surely they can't be all mine. Could have committed so many misdeeds. I'm a, respectable government official working in the highest academic institution in the state. I'm not a bad person, right? And so the official explains to him, he says, the spirits record any and all improper thoughts. Okay? Thoughts, improper thought will count as a misdeed. So it's not just words and actions. Okay, so and sure enough, all of the records related to Weizhongda. And then he sort of was curious. He said, well, may I ask what's been recorded in that scroll of my good deeds? How did it sort of outweigh all of the piles of misdeeds? Well, the official explained to him, he said, well, it's actually a copy of the memorial that you submitted to the emperor. Now, what is a memorial? It's a formal piece of writing where a government official is, advises on a course of action or advises against a course of action for their political superior. And in this case, it was the emperor. So the official explained that this slim single scroll of his good deed was just a copy of a memorial that he wrote and submitted to the emperor. And that memorial urged the emperor not to go ahead in the construction of a stone bridge that spanned three mountains because of the enormous cost and human efforts and the labourers. Want to take pity on the people who have to work on this enormous construction project. So the official explained, this is the copy of your memorial, but Weizhongda says, well, hang on a minute, the emperor never he didn't listen to me. The memorial was not successful. The emperor didn't listen to me and went ahead to, start the construction anyway. So how could it still count for so much? Well, the official explained to him, he said, if the emperor had took up your, followed and implemented your advice, then the good deeds accumulated from the consequences would have been infinitely greater. Okay, if the emperor had taken up Weizhongda's advice in the memorial, because it would have been more than just words on a page. But even though the emperor wasn't persuaded on this occasion and went ahead with the project, well, there was still considerable merit in that memorial. Number one, Weizhongda's sincerity in writing this memorial to the emperor, and also what he actually wrote down served as a positive example for others. And so there was still counted as a good deed. There was considerable merit there. So much so that it actually outweighed the masses and masses of the records of his misdeeds, from all of his improper thoughts. But the official went on to explain that, well, there's considerable merit in this, in your good deed, that's for sure. But the good fortune, that's the consequence of this good deed, has been much diminished by all of your improper thoughts. And as a result, unfortunately, you'll never be able to attain the position of chief minister. The position of chief minister is basically, the highest official in the land. You're just one down from the emperor himself. So basically the official was saying to him, well, look, you'll never be able to achieve the top job of chief minister. So Weizhongda, he returns to the land of the living, as we can imagine, with much renewed efforts to cultivate good deeds. And he works very hard. And he's ultimately promoted to the position of Minister for Personnel. Now, this is one of the ministries, one of 6 ministries that made up the administrative core of the central government at the time. This is Song China, Song Dynasty China, and the Ministry of Personnel, it's like a government department. It's responsible for the recruitment of government officials and their continuous appraisal. So responsible for their promotions and demotions, and also rewarding and recognizing government officials for meritorious service. So being the head of the ministry, he was the Minister for Personnel, was a very high, senior, very responsible, respectful position. But, he wasn't the chief minister. There were 5 others. And he was never promoted to be the chief minister. So Weizhongda's experience shows us 2 things. It tells us about the power of the mind and our thoughts. A person's future depends entirely on the nature of their thoughts. That's how important it is, these thoughts. And to this day, many people can identify and they can relate to his experience because, if you think about it, anyone can give rise to improper thoughts. Now, some of you might be wondering, what sort of thoughts are improper? Well, the treatise helpfully delineates, sets out very clearly the various types of improper thoughts. And we don't have the time to go into detail now, but I'll use some adjectives to describe so you sort of get the idea of what we mean by improper thoughts. They're thoughts that are deceptive, resentful, jealous, unkind, those sorts of thoughts along those lines. Well, this understanding that, a person's life destiny, their whole future, really depends on the nature of their thoughts. They really want to be avoiding these improper thoughts. Makes us realize the value of moral education. Sometimes it's called character education. More and more teachers, educators, and parents these days, right around the world, they recognize that, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, is not enough. They're very much interested in the 4th R, and that's respectfulness. Because any person, especially young person, needs to learn these moral education to develop their good character, to become a person with caring and compassion and common courtesy. So this moral education or character education, in some countries it's called character education, is a very big thing, especially among educators, teachers, primary school level, secondary school levels, right around the world. And it's been going on for some years now, actually. So the fact that, our futures, our life destiny hangs on our thoughts, the quality, the nature of our thoughts, makes us realize the value of moral education. Why that is because moral education, morality texts like the treatise, they help us recognize improper thoughts and the harmfulness of these thoughts on our fortunes. It helps us avoid these thoughts altogether and certainly not act on such impulses. Through these texts, a person is able to know and want to learn how to cultivate good deeds to improve their future, and they'll know how to change and to do so. But if you can imagine, without texts like the treatise, without moral education or character education, a person could be, it's like they're walking in the dark. They could be committing misdeeds and they won't even know it. They won't know to change their ways. And so they're bound to suffer misfortune at every turn. It would be a very sad situation. So this is how it works on the level of the individual. And certainly you can extrapolate for the fortunes of a family, being the sum total of the fortunes and misfortunes of every member of that family. And you can extrapolate in the same way for a community and the society, a global village, being the sum total of the fortunes, good fortunes, misfortunes of every one of its citizens. So there's a Chinese saying, and it goes like this: doing good deeds is like the grass growing in the springtime. And the grass is growing every day, but it may not be very noticeable. Committing misdeeds is like, the whetstone wearing away every time. But, this wearing away, the fact that it diminishes, may not be particularly obvious. And this Chinese saying highlights that what may or may not be so obvious or noticeable is the changes in a person's fortunes, their good fortunes or misfortunes, as their thoughts change. So the thoughts are really key. They're so important. Now, I wanted to say that when we recognize how important our thoughts are to our life and our future, it makes us realize that we really need to detect our thoughts. And to do that, to detect and reflect on our thoughts to make sure we're headed in the right direction, it's not difficult to understand that we would need a certain clarity of thought, to be focused and concentrated to be able to do that. But what is the worst enemy to focus and concentration? One of the worst enemies is to have wandering thoughts. Now, wandering thoughts arise. They might be about the past. So we might be thinking about the good times or the not so good times in the past. We can have wandering thoughts about the present. So we might come across a situation where we're not entirely sure what to do. Or should we do this or that or the other? And there could be wandering thoughts arising in relation to the future. We could be worried about what may or may not happen. So all of these wandering thoughts. And this is not to say that you shouldn't plan ahead as to what you're going to do next week or your homework assignment that's due at the end of the month. That's different. I'm talking about wandering thoughts. It could be like daydreaming. It's completely unproductive. Or worries are very unproductive as well. So wandering thoughts are the worst enemy, you could say, to having a focused and concentrated mind, which we need to be able to detect our thoughts and reflect on them, to check from time to time and, maybe on a daily basis, every night, to reflect on our day, what we thought about, as well as our deeds, obviously, but to double check that we're headed in the direction that we really want to be headed in. Okay, so that's the first two sentences. They are, the Exalted One states there are no gates to fortune and misfortune, and they're simply brought about by one's conduct. And the last part of this opening passage reads, the outcomes of reward and retribution are as shadow follows form. Now there's an analogy here, and it tells us two things. First, it tells us that, like a person's shadow, the consequences of our deeds will follow us wherever we go, for better or worse. And the outcomes, it means that these effects, the outcomes are guaranteed. So as soon as we plant a cause, that cause stays with us. It doesn't expire, doesn't disappear, doesn't go away. We're bound to experience the consequences, and they stay with us, these causes, until they give rise to the effects. So the outcomes are guaranteed. And the second thing to take away from this analogy is, if you can imagine each and every shadow, they basically match or correspond to the object. So the nature of our effects, the consequences that we'll end up living with, corresponds to the nature of the causes that we plant. Basically, we can't expect to grow beans if we plant apple seeds. We can't expect to enjoy good fortune if we haven't cultivated the good deeds. So that's in a nutshell. Outcomes are guaranteed, and the nature of the effects, those consequences, correspond directly to the nature of the causes. And it's not just the treatise that tells us this, but it's a very common message right throughout many of the time-honoured ancient texts. And to give an example, some of you might know about the classic of changes, the I Ching, as we call it in Chinese. That's the classic. Sometimes it's just called the changes. It's one of the, you'd say, the earliest texts associated with both the Taoist and Buddhist, the Confucian traditions of thought. And there's a passage in the classic of changes, and it goes like this: a family that accumulates good deeds is bound to enjoy much celebrations. A family that accumulates misdeeds is bound to endure much misfortune. So notice the key word here that's repeated is bound to. So the outcomes are guaranteed for sure. And notice that the celebrations, the good fortune, causes for happiness, they directly correlate to the good deeds. And the misfortune are directly related, correspond to the misdeeds. Okay, well, some people might ask, why is it that we do good deeds, but we never really see or get to enjoy any of the rewards? I did some good deeds yesterday or last year. How come I don't experience, or I'm not feeling the good rewards? Well, if you think about it, just as a plant takes time to grow and bear fruit and flowers, the consequences of our good deeds and our misdeeds sort of often not immediately apparent. That's most often the case. They're not immediately apparent in the short term. It might seem like a person gets to get away with committing a lot of misdeeds, scot-free. They may even profit from doing so. Or it might seem like a person's good deeds just go unrewarded. Life seems so unfair. I'm trying to be the good person here, trying to do the right thing. But actually, according to the Taoist and Buddhist traditions of thought, it's these consequences, it's just a matter of time before the consequences catch up with us. Remember, those outcomes are guaranteed, they're bound to happen. And what we're seeing when we see a person who's unkind, committing misdeeds and getting away with it seemingly scot-free, what we're seeing is that they're still enjoying the rewards from their past good deeds. Now, these good deeds could have been cultivated in their past lifetime, one of their past lifetimes, so they themselves won't remember, and we certainly haven't been around to see it for ourselves with our own two eyes. So that's the reason why they seem to be getting away scot-free. It's not that their misdeeds have no effects; those effects are guaranteed. And the same applies to when we see a good person doing a lot of good deeds, but they seem to be suffering a lot of misfortune. Does that mean the law of cause and effect doesn't apply to them? Or why is their life just so unfair? Well, that person, according to Taoist and Buddhist thought traditions, that person is actually suffering from the effects, the effects from previous misdeeds. And these could be misdeeds, in past decades or even a past lifetime. So they themselves might not remember. But rest assured that as soon as the effects from these previous deeds come to an end, once the rewards are exhausted, for example, well, the people will start to experience the consequences of the conduct, whether it's the good deeds or misdeeds in their current lifetime. Now, some people might say, well, what if I just do more good deeds? Doesn't that just cancel out all of the misdeeds? Unfortunately, that isn't quite the case. Good deeds and misdeeds do not cancel each other out. Okay, it's a popular misconception. What happens as soon as we plant a cause, whether it's doing a good deed or a misdeed, those causes stay around, they stay with us until they give rise to effects. And as we know before, these outcomes, the effects, are guaranteed. But these good deeds and misdeeds, they don't cancel each other out, but their effects can influence each other. So let me give you an example. Let's say a person is committing misdeeds and they keep doing so. They don't change. It's not difficult to understand that their negative consequences will just grow more and more severe. Okay, but one day they realize that they're wrong and they want to change. So they commit themselves to cultivating good deeds. From that time forward, that they're applying themselves 100% to cultivating good deeds. And so as soon as they cultivate, give rise to, a good thought, cultivate one good deed, well, they've planted a cause, a positive cause already. And if they continue doing so, well, the positive causes for good fortune might even outnumber the causes for misfortune. And so I'm saying that the misfortune that's waiting for them, that doesn't go away, but it might be postponed, and might be postponed for a very long time. And the same applies to a person who is cultivating good deeds, that they keep doing so, well, their good fortune is just going to multiply. But if they change and commit misdeeds, well, they'll start to have negative causes for negative effects. And if they accumulate enough of those, maybe they will suffer the negative consequences first. They'll be suffering the misfortunes well before they start enjoying the positive, the good fortune from their good deeds. So it is a little bit complicated, but it's important to remember that good deeds and misdeeds do not cancel each other out. Now, some people might say, well, how come, you read some of these stories and we'll read more in terms of the historical accounts, and it seems that, so-and-so donated a little bit of money, maybe to reprint the treatise. How could they enjoy such extensive good consequences, such great good fortune arising from just a small, seemingly very small cause? The fact is that small causes can sometimes give rise to extensive consequences, and it has to do with the speed of our thoughts. Now, in a very short space of time, remember that each thought counts as a cause. It's thought that counts. Each thought counts as a cause, and the lightning speed of our thoughts means that in a very short space of time, we can accumulate a lot of causes just purely from our thoughts, just like Wei Zhongda and all of his improper thoughts. And so that affects the magnitude and the duration of the effects, whether it's positive or negative, that we're bound to experience in the future. So these are just some basic principles to understand the law of cause and effect. I've got a final story, and that's the story of Huang Yongjie. And he lived on an island near Shanghai, and this was in the 18th century. So these are stories taken from all different periods of time, different places, but they help illustrate for us the principles of the treatise. Well, the fortune teller had told Huang Yongjie that he would have no children and he would only live to the age of 60. One day, there was a huge storm, and Huang Yongjie noticed that one of the boats in the waters was really struggling. It was in danger of capsizing. So what did he do? He immediately took out some money, and it was about 10 taels of silver, which is equivalent to about 20 grams in today's terms. And he hired a fishing boat to go out there and to save the passengers on the boat that was in struggling. And a total of 13 lives was actually saved. Later on, Huang Yongjie comes across the same fortune teller, and immediately the fortune teller could see that his fortunes had changed a lot. He could tell that Huang Yongjie had accumulated quiet merits. What are quiet merits? They're good deeds that no one knows about or no one notices. And so they're very significant. And he could update his predictions to tell Huang Yongjie that he will live to a very old age and that he will have children. And sure enough, Huang Yongjie had a son who topped the palace examinations. This is like the highest level of civil service examinations to qualify and be able to join the public service to serve as a government official. This is ultra significant at the time because being a government official, you bring honor and prestige to your family. You could improve, obviously, the economic situation of your entire family. But most importantly, people aspired to become government officials in those days because it would enable them to make a positive difference to society. Imagine the good deeds that you could accumulate just by passing one law to maybe lighten the taxes. So it was a chance to do a lot of good things for a lot of people. So he had a son who topped the civil service examinations and could look forward to a career in the government service as a government official. And Huang Yongjie himself, he lived into his 90s. So his story, you could say, and he actually passed away peacefully as well. And his is just one of the countless examples, stories, historical accounts that we find in the commentaries on the treatise. But his story shows us that sort of the law of cause and effect in action, sort of within the space of one lifetime. We can see his causes and the effects. And it confirms that a person's good deeds will lead them to enjoy good fortune. It's a natural way of the universe and means that a person can change their fortunes, like Huang Yongjie can change their fortunes by cultivating good deeds in thought, word, and action. It boils down to the nature of our thoughts and our minds. So as the old saying goes, be careful of our thoughts, for our thoughts become our words. Be careful of our words, because our words become our actions. Be careful of our actions, because our actions become our habits. Be careful of our habits, because our habits become our character. And be careful of our character, because our character becomes our destiny. It's very true. And it shows us that the mind is the root cause of our fortunes in life. Just by keeping our thoughts on the right track means that we can look forward to a promising future. And people in the past, certainly, they like to read the treatise. They did it regularly to remind themselves to keep on track to, good health and happiness. So you could say there's 3 takeaways from today's, talk. This text is a foundational text. The treatise is a foundational text in moral education because it helps us to understand that we need to accrue good deeds for good fortune and avoid the misdeeds to really avoid and prevent the misfortunes. The title itself can be understood, this Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao, might be understood as Laozi's teachings on the law of cause and effect. And finally, the opening passage enables us to understand that our fortunes and misfortunes depend entirely on ourselves. We're in the driver's seat. Our destiny it lies in our own hands. And we're bound to experience the consequences of our deeds in thought, word, or action, for better or worse. And we can't hope to enjoy the good fortunes if we haven't cultivated the good deeds. Well, next week, we're going to look at how it is that a person's every thought, word, and action can be known by others, according to the treatise and the Taoist tradition of thought. So thank you very much for your kind attention today, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much indeed.